Are you wanting to take your quilt top to a long armor to be quilted, but you're not sure quite what to do? Well, then keep watching because I have some great tips for you. Over the years, I've taken numerous quilts to different long arm quilters, and I have some tips that I think are really going to help you. Number one is you really need to find a long armor that you're comfortable with, and sometimes this takes a little bit of time. Sometimes you may take your quilt to a long armor and you may not be satisfied with what you get back, but there are some things you can do to help ensure a good experience with the first quilt you take in. The first thing I recommend you do is to do a little research regarding long arm quilters in your area, or if you want to try out some of the online long arm quilters that you can mail your quilt into. Check out the reviews, check out what other people are saying, ask your friends if they've ever used them, ask your friends who they use, ask your quilt guild members. You can also ask local quilt shops. A lot of quilt shops do offer long arm quilting services, so you can ask them who they might recommend, or you can ask them about their services. Now, for some of the long armors you're wanting to consider, you might ask them these questions before you decide on which one you're going to take your quilt to. You might want to ask them how long they've been quilting professionally. You can also ask to see some samples of their work. They should have plenty to show you. You're going to want to ask what their charges are and what do those charges include. One quilter that I like to take my quilts to, she charges per square inch. There's a thread charge, but she includes the batting in her cost. Another one of the quilters that I take my quilt to, she charges less and she doesn't include the batting. You have to provide the batting. So you want to be sure to check out what their charges are and what those charges include. If they provide the batting, you want to be sure to ask what kind of batting they're using. It may not be a type of batting that you want in your quilt. Now, sometimes I go with what they do, but sometimes I want a very specific batting in my quilt. You want to be sure to ask them how much overage they need for the backing fabric as well as the batting fabric, because when you take your quilt top in, you want to be sure you have enough to cover the backing and the batting. You also will want to know if they do edge-to-edge quilting or if they do custom quilting. Sometimes they'll do a combination of both. When I first started having my quilts quilted, they would do an overall pattern on the main portion of the quilt, but then they would do something much different in the border. Now that did cost a little bit more. Edge to edge is typically the cheapest, and then if you do edge to edge on the main portion, have a border put on, a specific border put on, that's a little bit more. And then if you do custom quilting is the most expensive quilting. You can also ask to see the patterns that they use. One of the quilters that I use, she has a book of all the patterns that she has available, and I like to flip through that when I'm deciding on the quilt pattern I want to use, if I don't already have that in mind before I go. Another thing that is especially important to me is you want to know how large the design is going to be. I do not like big, lofty quilting on my quilts. I like more dense quilting. I don't like it to be super dense, so I'm pretty specific when I take that in, when I take my quilt tops in to show them what size of quilting I want the repeating pattern to be. You're also going to want to know what their turnaround time is. Some of the long arm quilters I've used, they have a tremendous length of turnaround time. It's several weeks, 6 to 8 weeks out, and they do seem to get backed up, especially around Christmas. but sometimes I can get my quilts right in. So be sure to ask what the turnaround time is, especially if you have a deadline where you need that quilt before a birthday or a graduation or Christmas. Another important question that I think is important to ask is if they have a refund policy. One time I had a quilt quilted and there were lots of skipped stitches, and the quilter didn't realize that the machine had skipped so many stitches, so she did refund my money. She ripped out the quilting and she requilted my quilt, and she also replaced the back. She did everything she could to make that quilt right, and I really appreciated it because it was a bit of a mess with the skip stitches. Now those are just some of the questions that you might want to ask your long arm quilter before you decide. Okay, let's talk about some of the other tips. The second tip that I have is to be sure your quilt top lays flat. When you have a border that's wavy and looks like this, you might want to consider trying to fix that. If there's too much wave in the borders or too much wave within your quilt top, the long arm quilter may not be able to guarantee that there's not going to be any puckers, and that's really on you. There's only so much they can do to get your quilt quilted right, but you need to take it in good condition. The third thing I want to recommend you do is to do a stay stitch all around the outside edge of your quilt top. I do an 1/8 of an inch stay stitch all around the edge of my quilt top. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've taken several different quilt tops to several different quilters, and they have all commented on how nice that is. For me, it just helps eliminate the potential for your quilt top to be distorted and stretched, especially when some of the blocks on the outside edge have the bias on the edge. It just really helps control that. You also want to give your quilt top a good press. You want to be sure your seams on the back are laying as flat as possible. And the whole point of doing all this is to be sure that when the quilter puts the quilt on her machine, that it is laying flat. It's just going to help ensure a better overall outcome for the quilting. Number 4 is to be sure you clean up the back of your quilt top. Now that means cutting those loose threads. If you have red fabrics and white backgrounds and you have loose red threads, if you do not trim those off, those are going to show through. And I definitely speak from experience on that. So be sure you are clipping those loose threads. And you want to do that as one of the last things on the list, because the more you handle the fabric, the more you handle your quilt top, the more threads that are going to get loosened. And don't give your quilt top a good shake before you take it to the quilters, especially after you've trimmed the top, because you're going to have a whole new crop of loose threads. You want to handle that top as gently as possible after you've snipped all those threads, so you don't have to go back and do it again. Now here's a little side tip. If you pre-starch, you will have less loose threads. I have several videos out on pre-starching, so you can check out my playlist for those. Now after I've done those things, then I fold my quilt lengthwise so that it will hang easily on a hanger. For example, this is just a small quilt, but I've pressed it, I've done the stay stitch, I've cleaned up the back, and I have hung it over a hanger. And I do put a pool noodle over the hanger just so that I don't have a crease right along the edge there. Before you go to the quilters, you're going to want to measure your quilt, the length and the width of the quilt. The long arm quilter will want to know that. Now she may want to remeasure that, and that's okay. Don't be offended when they do that, but they will need the length and the width of your quilt top. You can actually estimate the cost of the quilting if you know how much they charge per square inch. All you need to do is take the length times the width times the cost per square inch. And that will give you a good estimate of what they charge. And then if they add additional charges in there, you will want to include those. If the quilter you select does not provide the batting, you will want to be sure you have your batting picked out and ready to go. Now, I do have a video out on selecting the right batting, and you can check this link out for that. An important thing I learned when picking out batting, if you're using light backgrounds, especially if you're using a white background, when I have a white background, I only use white batting. I do not use cream because I think that it can create a darker cast to your quilt, and you do not want to use any batting that has little pieces of cotton seed holes in the batting, because that will show through. And I speak from experience. I had a quilt quilted, I selected the batting, and sure enough, it showed through, and I was sick about it. Because every time I look at that quilt, I see those cotton seed holes. So be sure you've got clean batting, and I use white when I have a white background. You can also audition possible quilting thread colors for your quilt top. I have a video out that shows how to do that, and this is something you need to give some consideration to. One time I took a quilt in and I failed to tell the quilter what color of thread. She used red thread on a quilt that I had designed, and I did not like that. It was my fault, so I lived with it, but I did not like the red thread on that project because I wanted my piecing to shine, not the quilting. So you really need to give that a little bit of consideration when selecting the thread color. And you can check out the video on auditioning threads for quilting right there. You're gonna also want to consider what design you want put on your quilt. You do want to think about what pattern you want to have your quilt quilted with, and you can look online at edge-to-edge quilt patterns. There are lots of them out there, and you can ask your quilter if they have any of those patterns, and you can have them do custom quilting. I've had a couple of quilts custom quilted, and I've left it up to them, and those have turned out well. But I will tell you, if you decide to let them pick, then you've decided to let them pick. And if you don't like it when you get it back, that's what you allowed them to do. So be sure that you're going to be okay with everything if they, pick something that you don't like. Another thing you want to be sure to do is be sure that when you purchase your batting that you do allow for overage. Some machine quilters will ask for 3-inch on each side, some maybe 4 inches. I don't know if any of them require more than that, but they have to have a little extra inches on all sides. So that would be a total of anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 inches, depending on how much overage they need on each side. So be sure your batting is large enough, and be sure your backing is large enough. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention, when you prepare the backing for your quilt, I press that. I make sure that it's laying nice and flat, and I fold it and hang it on the hanger along with the quilt top. And the reason I do that is because I don't really feel like that's the responsibility of the quilter, and I want to be sure that my quilt top has every advantage for having a good positive outcome for when it's been quilted. If you have any additional tips you'd like to share, please be sure to list those in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and until next time, have fun quilting.